Good day. Today is Monday, 3rd March 2025, and I suppose one must say that the most important event of the last 24 hours is the summit meeting that took place in London, in Lancaster House to be precise, in which the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, presided over a meeting of leaders or representatives of 18 carefully selected European countries, plus Canada, and where President Zelensky of Ukraine was also present. Now, you'll probably detect here a sign of weariness in my comments about this meeting, but suffice to say that this was a meeting. It was supposed to be an emergency meeting. It's been described in that way. That, by the way, is not true. The meeting was planned at least a week ago. But anyway, what is called an emergency meeting was convened, and the extraordinary thing about it is that it's essentially an exact replay of what happened 2 weeks ago when Macron called many of the same leaders together for a meeting in Paris. Almost exactly the same statements were made, the same resounding words of support for Ukraine, the same showering of compliments upon Zelensky, and at the end of the meeting, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, came up with exactly the same proposal that he came up 2 weeks ago at the Paris meeting for a British-French expeditionary force masquerading as peacekeepers to be sent to Ukraine with troops from various other European countries and perhaps Canada tagging along for good measure. All of whom were to be provided with protection by the US military. It's a proposal, as I said, that Starmer floated 2 weeks ago in Paris. It was a proposal that both he and Emmanuel Macron attempted to sell to Donald Trump last week. Donald Trump, ever so politely, ever so graciously, basically said no. He refused to make the commitment for the guarantee or backstop or protection, or call it whatever you will, that Macron and Starmer were looking for. He had, as we all know, a furious row with Zelensky on Friday. So the great minds of the British and French governments and of the other European governments, well, they come up with a new plan, which is exactly the same as the old plan: send British and French peacekeeping forces with an American backstop to Ukraine following a ceasefire. Now, what is really very extraordinary about this is that this proposal is being floated by the British and the French, even though so far we have no negotiations of any kind going on about Ukraine. And I want to repeat this again. I know that I'm repeating myself on this, but the Americans and the Russians have not begun any negotiations about how to end the conflict in Ukraine, and may never do so. The American position continuing to be that this is something for the Russians and the Ukrainians to sort out between each other. Anyway, so there's no negotiations underway. There's no indications of any peace deal being on the table. Macron and Starmer and the other European leaders did not outline any kind of peace deal at this meeting in London, any kind of peace settlement, certainly not one that the Russians would ever entertain. Interestingly, they made proposals presupposing that before long there would be a ceasefire, deaf to the fact that both the Russians and the Ukrainians are rejecting a ceasefire. I'll come to that later. But anyway, they proceed, put up the same proposal again and again, notwithstanding that all the key stakeholders in the conflict, the United States, Russia, Ukraine itself, are rejecting the key proposals that Macron and Starmer are making. And also, they're not even negotiating yet. So it's very difficult to understand what this purpose of this meeting, in effect, is supposed to be. I'm going to say, again, that this was not a meeting that was called in a hurry. The meeting was actually discussed and obviously began to be organised around 10 days ago. You know anything about Lancaster House, you'd know that it would anyway take several days before Lancaster House and all the other arrangements for such a meeting, such a big meeting, could take place. So it was organised around 10 days ago. And when it was organised around 10 days ago, as I've discussed in previous programmes, as I've discussed in my programme yesterday, it was expected to have a completely different agenda. The assumption was that Macron and Starmer would be able to persuade, trick, manipulate Donald Trump, choose whatever word you prefer, to make the commitment to the British and the French and the Europeans that the United States would be there to protect them if they sent a protection force or a peacekeeping force or a reassurance force, or as I would say, a tripwire or warfighting force to Ukraine. It was assumed that Trump would agree to that last week. And it was also assumed that Zelensky would then get his, or rather the Americans would get the mineral rights extraction agreement from the Ukrainians, that would all be signed on Friday. And everything would, all the pieces would have fallen into place. The Americans and the Ukrainians would be friends again. The American commitment to the British and the French would have been provided. And then the meeting that took place yesterday would all have been about sorting out the arrangements for this force, the number of troops, the deployment places, all that kind of thing. Of course, it turned out otherwise because Donald Trump said no. As I've said, the meeting in the White House between Trump and Zelensky was a complete and total disaster. And, well, the logical thing, given that the original purpose of the meeting that took place yesterday had gone away, the logical thing would have been to call the meeting off. After all, there's supposed to be a follow-up meeting on Thursday, though technically that is an EU meeting, so Starmer would need a special invitation to attend, but then things like that could have been provided. But the logical thing would have been to postpone further discussion until this EU meeting on Thursday, and to call off the meeting whose purpose had, well, disappeared, had gone away. But of course that isn't how things operate in Europe anymore. There was another imperative behind the meeting on Sunday. Starmer and Macron and some of the other European leaders needed the meeting to show support, as they put it, for Zelensky, who was hailed as a hero throughout the meeting, hugged, as I discussed yesterday, by Keir Starmer. They needed to reaffirm their resolve to each other, so more talk about sending forces to Ukraine, that sort of thing. And, of course, all of this talk, all of this language, all of this repetition of demands for protection and security guarantees and all that kind of thing from the Americans is a way of communicating back to the Americans, to Donald Trump specifically, that the Europeans will not take no for an answer. They want their security force to be sent to Ukraine. They insist upon the United States providing the guarantees that they are asking for. And basically, it's a way of the Europeans sticking two fingers up at Donald Trump. It was put to me very well, by the way, by a Russian person that I had a discussion with earlier today, that the meeting in London on Sunday nominally was about criticizing Russia and Vladimir Putin. It was supposed to be, or it was presented as being a united front against Russia, whereas in reality the Europeans were criticizing was Donald Trump, and in reality it was a case of putting on a united front against the United States, or at any rate the current administration in the United States. The Europeans telling the Americans that they fundamentally disagree with what the Americans are doing, that the Europeans are not giving up on Project Ukraine, that they regard the American steps to normalize relations with Russia as an act of treachery and betrayal, and that the Europeans will do everything within their power to sabotage these moves, up to and including sending troops if they can find a way to do it, find a way to do it, to send troops to Ukraine. So ultimately, and in a sense, it was more an anti-American summit than an anti-Russian one. Definitely an anti-Trump summit, not an anti-Putin summit. This despite the fact that, of course, the European leaders were very careful not to utter open criticism of Donald Trump. On the contrary, Keir Starmer continues his long practice of pretending not to listen to what the Americans are saying, pretending not to listen to what Donald Trump is saying, still saying that the United States is a reliable ally of Europe and all that. By reliable ally means reliable accomplice, if you like, in Project Ukraine. Still insisting on all of this. But behind all the words, the messaging actually is fairly clear. Now, having said this, we do have this proposal for European troops to be sent to Ukraine. As I said, no details were announced, and in fact, the cracks beneath the surface are clearly there. So Meloni made comments which suggested that she's really not at all keen on this project. Poland continues to make clear that it is not prepared to send troops to Ukraine under pretty much any circumstances. There were even divisions starting to appear between Starmer and Macron, the two main co-conspirators, if I can put it like that, behind the show that was put on in London on Sunday. So Macron, shortly after the meeting, came out and started briefing everybody and making statements to the effect that he was in favour of a 1-month ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine, a temporary ceasefire. Now, when you actually examine what Macron really was proposing, it becomes immediately clear that what he was proposing was not really a ceasefire at all. It was basically a cessation of air operations, in which, of course, the Russians have an overwhelming advantage, some kind of cessation of drone attacks on energy systems. But of course, again, it is the Ukrainians who are suffering far the heavier blows from the attacks on the energy systems. But apparently the ground fighting would not be affected. So it was not really a ceasefire. It makes, in fact, very little sense. And as we will see, not just the Russians, but Zelensky himself goes repeatedly out of his way now to say that he is strongly opposed to a ceasefire. Anyway, Macron came up with this idea, I suspect, for no better reason than to steal some of the thunder from Keir Starmer. As anybody who has followed Macron's career with any attention will know, Macron is a man of extraordinary vanity. He always insists upon and expects to be the centre of attention. The Paris summit 2 weeks ago was his chance to shine. He made a similar attempt to shine when he went to Washington exactly a week ago and had his various meetings with Donald Trump. He is now very resentful, clearly, that the meeting with Donald Trump was a failure. He's very resentful that in the latest discussions and the latest summit meeting, he's no longer the host. Keir Starmer is. And so, well, his jealousy and resentment and his annoyance that he's no longer the centre of attention and the person making the proposals boiled over. And obviously, without consulting the British and obviously without talking to Zelensky, out of the thin air, he plucked out this idea for a 1-month temporary ceasefire, which in fact is not a ceasefire. Anyway, Zelensky is quite clear that he is opposed to this ceasefire proposal. The British apparently were blindsided by it. Some of the initial messaging, I suspect coming from the French, was that the British were in agreement with this idea. Over the course of the day, as the British realised that this proposal was starting to gain attention, and as they also realised that their great friend and beloved leader, the new Churchill, Vladimir Zelensky, was opposed to a ceasefire, the British began to distance themselves from this idea of Macron's, which therefore is likely to be stillborn. So we have exactly the same proposal made 2 weeks ago. The proposal the Americans have rejected. The proposal the Russians have said is completely unacceptable. We've had, however, more opportunities, a further platform given to Vladimir Zelensky, and he continues to speak and he continues to create problems for his European allies and say things that undoubtedly are going to infuriate the Americans and which ultimately play into the Russians' hands. So first thing, Zelensky said that he strongly opposes a ceasefire, any sort of ceasefire, apparently. There's a long report about this in the Financial Times. According to this report, Zelensky is telling everybody that he remembers 2014 and the Minsk I agreement and how a ceasefire was agreed then and how the Russians, he always speaks about the Russians, never mind that at the time they were not even a party and did not participate in the discussions at that time, at least they were not formally a party in the conflict. At the time, it was a conflict between the Ukrainian government and the Donbass militias, just saying. But anyway, he always talks about the Russians. And he says that it was the Russians after Minsk I who didn't honour the ceasefire that was agreed through Minsk I in September 2014, and therefore, And for that reason, he no longer trusts the Russians to abide by ceasefire. Ever since then, he's learnt that lesson. And if there's going to be a ceasefire now, well, there have to be security guarantees. Ukraine has to be provided with security guarantees by the United States. And there have to be European peacekeepers and NATO troops and all of those things in Ukraine as well. That's what Zelensky, according to the Financial Times, is now saying. Now, I don't want to spend time unpacking this, or too much time unpacking this, but that this is complete nonsense in terms of Zelensky's own motivations ought to be immediately obvious, because he's complaining about alleged failure of the Russians to honour a ceasefire agreed in September 2014, in which case, why did he stand for president and say that he wanted to be elected in order to implement the main Minsk agreement, Minsk II, if you like, the agreement that was agreed in February 2015, which, of course, incorporated a ceasefire. In fact, the very same ceasefire that had been agreed under the terms of Minsk I. What was a problem in September 2014 for Zelensky, and what is a problem now, apparently was not a problem when Zelensky was elected president. Well, there's no point in wasting too much time working through Zelensky's inconsistencies. The way in which he says one thing one day, something completely different the next day. He comes up with his reasons for not doing whatever it is that he doesn't want to do. But one can spend time and energy, as I said, unpacking it all. The simple fact is that Zelensky doesn't want a ceasefire. He has never at any time supported a ceasefire. Sometimes he talks about ceasefires. Sometimes he talks about peace and negotiations with the Russians. But when pushed, when the Americans or whoever tried to pin him down, immediately he slips away and comes up with a reason for not doing that which he has given the impression, the previous impression, that he might be willing to do. So the Russians don't want a ceasefire, and Zelensky doesn't want a ceasefire either. Now, as I said, he said this many times. What he wants is not a ceasefire. He doesn't want anything that might cause aid to stop from the West. If he has to agree to a ceasefire, it has to be a ceasefire negotiated on terms which he expects will eventually deliver him victory. A ceasefire in which the Americans give guarantees to Ukraine and to European peacekeepers, a ceasefire in which European forces are deployed to Ukraine, a ceasefire which he can then arrange to be violated so that he can blame the violations on the Russians, provoke the conflict between the Russians and the European forces, and drag in the Americans so that the Americans can win the war for him. This has been his consistent strategy for years now, arguably since 2022, when the special military operation began, but definitely since the failure of Ukraine's own summer offensive in 2023. It's the only way that he can imagine Ukraine achieving victory, and he will settle for nothing less than victory. So when Macron comes along and suggests a 1-month ceasefire, even this very limited ceasefire, Zelensky's bound to reject it. If there's talk about a ceasefire without American guarantees, he will reject it. If there's talk about a ceasefire without peacekeeping forces or intervention forces from Europe, he will reject it. He will reject any serious move towards peace. Now, I'm going to return now, probably for the last time, because I think this whole topic is likely to become historic. I'm now going to return briefly to the topic of the mineral extractions rights agreement that the Americans and the Ukrainians negotiated with each other that caused all those temper tantrums and anger on the part of Zelensky, and which led directly to the blow-up between Zelensky and the Americans in the Oval Office on Friday. A blow-up which, as I have explained, and which as many other people have also explained, by the way, Zelensky undoubtedly, intentionally provoked. By the way, on that topic, the US National Security Advisor, Donald Trump's National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, who until a few weeks ago was clearly very sympathetic to Ukraine, he's one of the most pro-Ukrainian figures within the US government. In fact, there was a lot of talk that Waltz and Kellogg together made up the anti-Russian, pro-Ukrainian, semi-neocon faction within the Ukrainian government. Anyways, Waltz has given an interesting, fascinating interview in which he's discussed the whole blow-up on Friday, and he's given his own account of what happened. And fascinatingly, he says that after the media left, when Zelensky was still in the White House and was still with Trump and Vance, far from adjusting his position, far from taking a step back, far from saying to the Americans, look, I'm terribly sorry, all that ran completely out of control. I don't know what came over me. I don't know what I was saying. Of course I'm going to sign the mineral extractions agreement. I'm going to sign it now. Rather, I'm going to get my ministers to sign it, because there was never any sort of plan that he would sign it. Instead of doing any of those things, or indeed staying silent, Zelensky, on the contrary, sought to continue the argument that had previously raged in front of the cameras. And apparently it was this that finally exasperated the Americans and was what caused Donald Trump to say that Zelensky needed to leave the White House, an event which led to Zelensky being escorted out of the building. Now, Mike Waltz says that he tried to get Zelensky to think again, to try to moderate his words, perhaps to speak some emoluments to the Americans. And he pointed out to Zelensky that Ukraine does not have an unlimited amount of time. And Zelensky was having none of it. This despite the fact that his ambassador was obviously shaking, that Andrei Yermak, his chief of staff, was close to tears. This is all Mike Waltz's account. Despite the shock and dismay on the part of Ukraine's delegation, Zelensky just continued trying to argue the same points, litigate them, as J.D. Vance put it, all over again. He was being as rude and aggressive and as demanding and as entitled and as arrogant as always. And it was this, finally, that caused the Americans to say enough. So, that's the reality of the person Zelensky is. He is never himself going to agree peace. I would add, by the way, that despite what Waltz says about the shock and dismay and distress of the other Ukrainian officials who were present, And I suspect that they must be increasingly exasperated with Zelensky themselves. Despite all of that, I don't get the sense that the Ukrainians fundamentally differ from the points that Zelensky is making. I see no real sign that anybody within the Ukrainian political leadership is any more willing to agree to a peace settlement with the Russians than Zelensky himself is. Zelensky is not interested in peace. He is only interested in victory. Whether he's doing this for purely acquisitive reasons, as many suspect, I am one of those people, I should quickly say, or whether it is because he has developed a messianic, self-aggrandizing view of himself, as others, notably the American journalist Simon Schuster, have been saying. I mean, it hardly matters. The point is, he is never going to seek peace, and I don't think anybody else in Ukraine is either. And again, this is one of the fundamental realities that the Europeans themselves are not acknowledging. Probably they are not acknowledging it because deep down they share the same perspective that Zelensky does. The Americans are saying that any peace requires compromise, but the Europeans are not ready for compromise. They continue to insist that the war must be carried on, and they continue to speak of victory. Now, to get a sense of what the mood in London is like, I'm going to go to a comment that has been made today in The Guardian by my old friend, Simon Tisdall. And, well, he's an extremist, even by British standards. But I don't think that his outlook, his perspective, fundamentally differs from that of the British leadership or from the wider European leadership either. And he says this, and this is in his article today. Starmer says that he and Macron are now developing a plan. It's funny to hear that, developing a plan. Those of you who remember the British comedy series Blackadder that used to appear in the 1980s will remember how one of the characters was always coming up with a cunning plan. I have to say, reading about how Starmer and Macron are now developing a plan reminds me an awful lot of that. Anyway, Starmer says that he and Macron are now developing a plan. Good! The leading European NATO powers should demand an immediate halt to all fighting in Ukraine and Kursk. Simon Tisdall, as I said, is apparently unaware or in ignorance of or in denial of the fact that Zelensky himself is refusing this. But anyway, that's what he says. They should launch a peace process inclusive of all interested parties without preconditions or prior concessions. If Putin balks, they must withdraw their diplomats, close borders with Russia, move to interdict its exports, mobilize their armed forces, and set a deadline for providing defensive air cover for all unoccupied Ukrainian territory. Russia must be reminded that the West has teeth too and will, if forced, resist Putin's unlawful aggression and everything it has got. Enough of Trump's scaremongering nonsense about a third world war. Putin is a mass murderer, not a mad murderer. He's also a coward. Simon Tisdall invariably says that anybody he dislikes, be it Trump, Putin, Benjamin Netanyahu, is a coward. How he knows that, what his basis for using that slur is, I really don't know. Whatever one may think about Vladimir Putin, his actions over the last 3 years, whether you agree with them or not, certainly required a high degree of courage and a coward of any sort. He obviously is not. I would also add that in Trump's case, taking on the entire American political class, as he too has been doing for around 10 years now, is not the action of any sort of coward. But anyway, I digress. This supposedly is the plan, an unconditional ceasefire, which, as I said, Zelensky himself has rejected. And, well, steps, if the Russians don't agree, and of course they've also said that they won't agree to a ceasefire, steps which amount basically to a declaration of war against Russia. Just think of what would happen if all of the things that Simon Tisdall was talking about was really done. If the Europeans withdrew their diplomats, closed their borders, moved to interdict Russian exports, in other words, start seizing Russian ships in the high seas and that kind of thing, mobilized their armed forces and set a deadline for providing defense air cover for all unoccupied Ukrainian territory. Well, things like that have been done in the past. It reminds me very much, by the way, of what happened in July 1914. At that time also, the Europeans started to withdraw diplomats from each other's countries, call on all their people to return, started mobilizing their forces. It was all supposed to be part of a complicated game of negotiations, or some people thought at the time. Well, there may have been a few people who thought otherwise, and there's some reason to think that in Berlin and Vienna there were indeed people at that time who sought war. But anyway, the point is that if it all was an attempt to bluff the other side into capitulation, it achieved the diametrically opposite result. And we did indeed find ourselves, Europe did indeed find itself in what quickly became the First World War. And here we see Simon Tisdall today, in a world with nuclear weapons, proposing to try the same stunt against the world's biggest nuclear power. But anyway, again, maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on Simon Tisdall. Let me repeat again the point that the Europeans can talk about deploying forces to Ukraine. Simon Tisdall and Macron can talk about unconditional or unilateral ceasefires. But the Europeans have no power to make any of these things happen. They certainly will not do any of the crazy things that Simon Tisdall is talking about, though I suspect there are some people in London and perhaps the Baltic states who would not be sorry if these things were indeed done. But anyway, they're not going to be able to do it. The Americans will soon, very soon, I suspect, put a stop to it. They have no power to do these things. The Europeans have themselves acknowledged that they cannot send troops to Ukraine to confront the Russians without an American backstop. So, despite Simon Tisdall's pontifications, they need the Americans to agree to provide the military backstop, which the Americans are not providing. Without the Americans, what Simon Tisdall is saying cannot realistically be done. The Europeans, to do all of these things, would need the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire. And for the moment, at least, Zelensky is not agreeing to it. Perhaps he would agree if he really was promised World War III, but anyway. And of course, the Russians will not agree to it. They will not agree to the terms of their capitulation at a time when they are winning the war, and they would not be impressed by the sort of forces that Europe would be able to scratch together and deploy against them. And, well, what the attitude of the European publics would be if any of these things were done, I cannot imagine. Now, we can discuss and analyse all of this at great length, but two things stand out for me. Nothing can be done without the United States. Europe lacks the military power to do it. Zelensky himself is admitting this. So is Starmer. So, what we are seeing here is that the Europeans, with their proposals for peacekeeping forces, and Zelensky, with his relentless demands for security guarantees, what they're trying to do is to press the Americans to agree to something that the Americans have already rejected, because the Americans fear that if this process were to continue, it would escalate and would lead us exactly to World War III. The Europeans and the Ukrainians, in their obsession with inflicting a strategic defeat on Moscow, are wanting to drag the Americans along into a conflict with Russia in order to fulfill Ukrainian and European objectives, but not American ones. When people like Elon Musk start calling into question the benefits of NATO, whether NATO is a good idea anymore, whether this alliance between the Europeans and the Americans any longer serves US interests, well, you could see where they are coming from. I want to make it very clear that I don't expect the NATO alliance to collapse tomorrow or next week or in a year's time or even in 10 years' time. But here we can see that the Americans will be observing how their own allies are trying to lead them, in effect, into an armed confrontation with the Russians, something which even Joe Biden said back in 2022 would amount to a nuclear war. Now, a third world war. Now, it's not even as if American intentions are so difficult to understand. First of all, we've had an article in The Guardian by somebody called Stephen Wertheim, who is a member of a fellow, I believe, of the American Statecraft program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he has outlined, in my opinion, American objectives fairly clearly. He said the crux of the American message seems to be this: the United States will either broker an end to the war in Ukraine in short order or remove itself from the conflict unless perhaps it deems Russia to have obstructed a ceasefire. As Trump told Zelensky on Friday, you are either going to make a deal or we are out. Washington will also refuse to make any commitment to Ukraine's post-war security, such as NATO membership, that would run a major risk of drawing the United States into a direct war with Russia. World War III, as Trump sees it, if Russia invades Ukraine again. The United States has the sovereign right to adopt this stance for the sake of its own interests, which include limiting the costs and risks the United States is bearing for European defence. So Europe cannot dissuade the United States, but it can work with Washington to achieve US goals whilst finding the best possible arrangement to protect Ukraine, secure Europe, and preserve NATO. However, European leaders are hearing a different message, and one version is maximally pessimistic. Europeans fear that Trump is aligning with Vladimir Putin. He says this is most unlikely. And the other is a little more optimistic, that they can convince Trump, despite everything that Trump and the Americans have said, to make a major US security guarantee to Ukraine. This effort drove British, French, and Ukrainian leaders to visit the White House last week. In public remarks, all three attempted to sell Trump on providing a US backstop for a European military force. Trump did not rule out some support for a European military force, but he indicated little willingness to put much American muscle behind it. And the article points out again that Zelensky has rejected a ceasefire. In the Oval Office, he said to Trump directly, "We will never accept just a ceasefire. It will not work without security guarantees." And in short, Zelensky insisted he would not agree to a ceasefire unless the United States provided precisely what Trump had seemingly already ruled out. And then this article warns, if Ukraine and Europe continue to push for strong US security guarantees, they have a small chance of succeeding and a larger chance of creating a permanent rupture with Trump. The president could conclude that his allies refuse to listen and, worse, keep trying to entrap him. Throwing up his hands, he could take the very actions that Ukraine and Europe most want to avoid, cutting off all US support for Ukraine and making a deal with Putin. So there it is. I mean, this is essentially it sets out here everything that I've been saying throughout last week and over the last couple of days about the diplomacy we saw in Washington last week. Macron, Starmer, and Zelensky tried to trick the Americans into giving Ukraine a security agreement. And not just the Ukrainians, but the Europeans as well. And Trump refused to fall for it. Now, at this point, I want to talk about, as I said, the mineral deal again, because there's been a lot of discussion about it. There's been discussions about it by people like Alex Craner, individual I know, and for whom I have a vast respect, and others in the United States as well. And it's been suggested that one of the reasons for the bust-up on Friday and for the huge American anger and for the actions of the British and the French and all of those is that, in fact and in reality, secretly, back in January, Vladimir Zelensky already signed a deal as part of his 100-year security treaty with the British, giving all of these mineral rights to the British. So he has in effect done what con men always often do, which is sold the same thing to more than one party. And that what we're basically seeing here is a tussle being carried out by the Americans and the British over who ultimately will get the mineral rights. Well, I think there's probably an awful lot to this, and I think there is it's probably highly likely, to use a British expression. I think it's almost certainly the case that some kind of deal about mineral rights between the British and the Ukrainians has indeed been done, and this does cut across the agreement between the Americans and the Ukrainians. And the Americans were aware of all of this, and it may be that this mineral rights deal was partly intended basically to show up the British and embarrass the Ukrainians and, well, ultimately put them both in their place. I accept that there might have been an element of this. But again, I think in understanding the mineral rights deal, it's perhaps useful, more useful, to look at what the Americans themselves, the American government, American officials, Trump, Waltz, Scott Bassett, Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance have all been saying about the mineral rights deal. Because if you listen to them, they've been giving a consistent message, which is that they saw Ukraine's commitment to the mineral rights deal as a test of whether or not the Zelensky government was generally interested in achieving peace. The point is that without peace, the mineral extractions deal could never come into effect. So if the Ukrainians did sign the deal and did do so in good faith, then that would be a sign that they were generally prepared, sincerely prepared, to work with the Americans to find a way out of the war and to achieve peace with Russia, a long, sustained peace with Russia. So I think from that perspective, as I said, the mineral rights deal makes more sense. I think it was a test that the Americans were making of Zelensky. And when Zelensky came to Washington, and instead of signing the mineral rights deal or getting his ministers to sign the deal, as the Americans had told him to do, as Scott Bassett had explained to him he had to do, when Zelensky came to Washington and started restarting all the discussion about military guarantees, security guarantees, and all of those things that he had brought up so many times before, including in the row he'd had in Kiev with Scott Bassett, the Americans concluded that he had failed the test. He wasn't prepared to sign the deal. He didn't really, therefore, want peace. And basically, ultimately, that was why they sent him on his way. The Americans want peace, or at least they want an end to the fighting in Ukraine. They've made it very clear why. Trump has talked about the human catastrophe that's playing out in Ukraine. And let's not be entirely cynical about that. There's no reason to be. But the Americans also know that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that the Russians are winning, and they want to bring the war to an end before there is a catastrophic outcome. And besides, they want to staunch the unending supply of weapons and finance to Ukraine in what the Americans have concluded now is essentially a lost cause. So that was the test that Zelensky was given on Friday, and he didn't fulfill it. And he's coming now and making statements both in Washington and London about not wanting a ceasefire. And he's making conditions, and he's trying clearly to draw the Americans into the war, and the Europeans want to draw the Americans into the war. They are, in effect, doing exactly what this article in The Guardian warned against. If they continue to push for strong US security guarantees, they have a small chance of succeeding and a larger chance of creating a permanent rupture with Trump. The president can conclude that his allies refuse to listen and, worse, keep trying to entrap him. Throwing up his hands, he could take the very actions that Ukraine and Europe most want to avoid, cut off all US support for Ukraine, and making a deal with Putin. And by the way, that appears to be what is happening. The Americans are now saying that Zelensky coming back now, after all that's happened, and saying that he's going to sign the minerals extraction deal is no longer enough. Firstly, he has to apologize for the scene that he threw in the White House, something that he absolutely ceases to do, and convince them, and it's very difficult to see how he can convince them, that he really is serious now about brokering a peace. And we're getting more and more reports that the Americans are now edging ever closer to doing what this article in The Guardian said. Trump throwing up his hands, taking the very actions that the Ukrainians and the Europeans most want to avoid, cutting off all US support for Ukraine and making a deal with Putin. So, firstly, we're getting reports out of the United States, they're not confirmed, that there's going to be a high-level meeting of US officials in Washington. Trump is supposed to chair it, and there's going to be a discussion about cutting off all further aid to Ukraine, military, economic, all aid, perhaps even switching off the Starlink system. Apparently there's going to be discussions about this. We are told, this is from Reuters, that there are differences within the American government about this. There are some people in Washington who are now so angry that they want to move forward with this step. Others perhaps hope that something can be retrieved from the wreckage and want to proceed more slowly than this. My own guess is that Trump's inclinations are to go with the hardliners. I think he was personally deeply offended by Zelensky's behavior, and he has himself concluded that Zelensky is not interested in peace. He's apparently spoken very, very favourably about the way in which J.D. Vance conducted himself in the Oval Office meeting. And I think if Trump were to make the decision purely on the basis of his instincts, he quite plausibly might cut off all US aid now and throw it back into the hands of the Europeans. However, politics is complicated. Ukraine is still has supporters in the United States. They're particularly strong in Congress. He's got to think about the Republican Party in the Senate, in which there are still neocon holdouts. It's not impossible that Trump might pull back and decide that maybe some aid could be restricted, but other aid, perhaps Starlink, for example, could continue. We'll see. But the Americans did do one thing today, which has not received much publicity, and which is actually quite important, which is that apparently Pete Hegseth, the new US Defense Secretary, has ordered the relevant department within the Pentagon to stop trying to conduct cyber attacks against Russia. It seems that over the last 3 years there's been a cyber war raging between the Russians and the Americans. The Americans have been trying to launch cyber attacks on the Russians. The Russians have been countering. It's not received a huge amount of attention, certainly not until now. But Pete Hegseth, in what must be seen, by the way, as a major de-escalatory move, has apparently decided to call the whole thing off. It doesn't mean that all US cyber attacks on Russia will cease. Cyber attacks against Russia are also conducted, apparently, by the NSA, and I'm guessing by the CIA. It could be that those two agencies will continue to conduct cyber attacks against Russia, though I think it unlikely. I would have thought that the new Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and the new CIA chief, John Radcliffe, will probably follow where Pete Hegseth has left, and this underground cyber war that has been raging will be finally called off. Now, I should say I have a personal interest in all of this because I remember that back in 2017, at the height of the Russiagate frenzy, articles appeared in the Washington Post about how the Obama administration had granted authorization to the US intelligence community to plant cyber bombs in Russian infrastructure, which would have devastating impact and which the United States would be able to trigger whenever it chose. Well, apparently there has been a cyber war, at least at some level, between the United States and Russia over the last 3 years. But I've not heard of anything happen in Russia that had the kind of catastrophic effect that all of that talk of cyber bombs back in 2017 might have led one to expect. Obviously, the Russians have had time since 2017 to make their own preparations, and it looks as if they have done. I can't help but think that, like so many other wonder weapons that we've been hearing about over the course of this war, all that talk back in 2017 of cyber weapons, of cyber bombs, and all of that has fallen far short of what we were led to presume. Anyway, there it is. The Americans continue to make steps, gradual steps, to try and de-escalate the conflict with Russia. And CNN says that the Americans are now accelerating work on getting the meeting with Putin set up. The Americans, furious with the way Zelensky acted, apparently keen to move forward with the process of normalization with Russia and anxious to speak with Putin himself. So it's likely that at some point this month, this summit meeting between the Americans and the Russians will take place. I said that for the Americans, the mineral rights deal was apparently a test of Zelensky's good faith, his willingness to seek peace in the conflict, something which, as far as the Americans are concerned, he failed. For the Russians, the recent meeting in Istanbul and the discussions that took place there about unblocking the embassies was, for them, a symbol of American good faith. They wanted to see what steps, if any, the Americans would actually take. The meeting, as I said, it turns out went quite well, and I suspect that steps now to arrange this meeting between Putin and Trump will now happen. Well, there it is. The Europeans still fantasizing about keeping this war going. There's been a speech by Starmer to the British House of Commons. I've been getting reports of it even as this programme has been underway. It seems to be all the usual boilerplate language that one might expect. No real rethinking there. Zelensky, as I've said many, many times, digging in and insisting that he must get everything he wants from the Europeans, from the Americans. He refuses to apologize. He refuses to give up on his demands for security guarantees. For him, war is better than peace. Certainly peace that falls short of victory. And I think, especially after what happened yesterday in London, we are now probably closer to that point of Trump throwing up his hands and cutting off all US support to Ukraine and doing the deal, the normalization deal with Putin. Anyway, it's not just the Americans and the Europeans and the Ukrainians who are talking. The Russians have also been talking to their Chinese friends. Now, Xi Jinping recently had a telephone call with Putin, friendly call by all accounts. Now, over the last couple of days, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Putin's national security advisor, has gone to Beijing, where he's had meetings with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, who also happens to be Xi Jinping's national security advisor. And then he had a joint meeting with Xi Jinping himself, which Wang Yi also attended. Now, there's the usual long Chinese readout. The Russians have not provided a readout. Shoigu is not a member of the foreign ministry, and he's not part of the Kremlin team. So the Russians have not actually provided a detailed readout. The Chinese have provided a very, very long readout, but it is very, very uninformative. My guess is not, as many people think, that the Russians are telling the Chinese about the state of the negotiations between themselves and the Americans, because so far the Russians have engaged in no substantive negotiations with the Americans. I think what the Russians are doing at this point is that they're consulting with the Chinese in advance of the forthcoming meeting between Putin and Trump. The Russians obviously need to keep the Chinese sure that Russia is not going to abandon China and realign with the United States. There is, of course, absolutely no possibility of that. The Chinese, I don't think, imagine it. But probably the Russians want to explain to the Chinese the sort of things that Putin is likely to tell Trump when they do meet, the sort of things Russians expect Trump to say to Putin, what potential points of agreement and disagreement there might be, and the Russians will be interested in hearing whether the Chinese have a point of view on any one of those points. I don't think there will be much contention, actually. The Chinese media has covered these contacts between the Americans and the Russians, and it has done so in relatively favourable terms. So I don't think there's going to be very much contention. But it is, if I may say so, a tactful and wise move by the Russians. Keep your main partner, in some respects your senior partner, informed of what you are going to do, so that you don't get any cross wires and misunderstandings, and so that the Chinese don't feel, after the discussions between Trump and Putin, that they're being presented with any fait accompli. So that is what I think that is all about. It does make an interesting contrast with the situation now between the Americans and the Europeans. Nominally, the Americans and the Europeans are allies. They're all members of NATO. China and Russia, by the way, do not have a treaty between them. So they are not in allies in the way that the Europeans and the Americans are. But the Europeans and the Americans are talking past each other. There are growing signs of rancor. There's talk in Europe of treachery and betrayal and all of that. The Americans, for their part, are becoming increasingly exasperated by the Europeans. By contrast, the Russians and the Chinese have a civilized conversation. They talk about what the Russians are going to do, and they're moving the process between them forward. By the way, China is not the only country that has received a detailed briefing from the Russians. Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, who obviously has a vested interest in making sure that the relationship between Russia and North Korea remains stable and continues to develop, and who must be somewhat concerned by signs of a Russian-American rapprochement, has sent a senior member of the North Korean Politburo to Moscow. This person has been received by none other than Putin himself, and the Russians undoubtedly will have briefed and reassured the North Koreans also about what they're doing. Well, I will just say quickly, before I wrap up this program, that the military situation in Ukraine continues to deteriorate for Ukraine. We heard an awful lot over the last couple of days about the various Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk and Toretsk area. The latest word is that the Ukrainian counterattacks in the Pokrovsk area have indeed been unsuccessful. The Russians seem to be confident that the raids, more than counterattacks into Toretsk, have failed as well. There is some reports today of the Ukrainians launching some kind of counterattack in the Kupiansk area, even as the Russian bridgehead west of the Oskol River goes on getting larger. The big news, however, is from Kursk. The Russians have successfully established fire control over the main supply road. Radovka has a detailed account of how this was done. Apparently, the Russian drones can reach the road in at least 3 large locations. It's becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to send supplies along this road. The weather is getting warmer in Ukraine. We are now into the season of the Rasputitsa, the spring thaw. That means that wheeled vehicles trundling with supplies are not really able to cross swampy fields. That's going to put the Ukrainian garrison in Suja, which is said to number around between 10 and 20,000 men, in an extremely precarious position. And meanwhile, the Russians, no doubt, are taking advantage of the Rasputitsa to sort out their logistics. There's lots of film and photographs of how the Russians are sorting out the roads around Chasov Yar and other places. Probably they're also rebuilding and refurbishing the railways. The Russians have captured lots of railways over the last couple of months, some of which probably are in rather poor condition and need repair. There was a major railway line, for example, near the fortified town of Ugledar, which the Russians were unable to use whilst Ugledar was under Ukrainian control. Ugledar has been under Russian control for several months now. Probably that railway line has now been brought back into a good state of repair. That means that the Russians can send more men, machines, supplies, ammunition, fuel, and my guess is that a major build-up is probably taking place, and sometime around April, the Russian offensive will restart, but with much, much greater force. And at that point, the crisis that Ukraine is facing will, of course, multiply. And if there is a cut-off of American aid, well, things will at that point become critical. If you want to get a really fine overview of the state of Ukraine today, not just the military, but the political situation there, Gordon Hahn, the American scholar Gordon Hahn, has written a superb discussion of conditions in Ukraine today and how bad the situation there altogether has become. I'm going to finish this program with a quote from Dmitry Peskov. He said he attended a briefing today in the Kremlin. He said the Kiev regime and Zelensky do not want peace. They want the war to continue. So in this situation, of course, only Washington's efforts and Moscow's readiness will obviously not be enough. The regime refuses to settle the conflict through negotiations. Now that appears to hint at the situation in the war going from bad to worse, and that the prospects for a negotiated settlement are simply not there, because the Kiev regime, the government in Kiev, the authorities in Kiev cannot compromise and will not give up on their maximalist objectives, because doing so would be the end of their vision of Ukraine, something which emotionally they simply cannot give up. Now, following from that and going back to that Gordon Hahn piece, Gordon Hahn makes the point that even as the situation in Ukraine is deteriorating, the ultra-nationalist factions in Ukraine, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, the Maidan movement, is once again becoming further radicalized. And he makes the point that some leaders of this movement, notably Dmitry Yarosh, who was the head of Right Sector, one of the groups that was instrumental in carrying out the overthrow of Yanukovych's government in February 2014, and Belitsky, the founder and effective head of the Azov brigades, they're both saying that the time has now come to complete the transformation of Ukraine, to transform Ukraine in an even more nationalist direction. My own view is that the various personalities within the Kiev system that people have been talking about, people like Poroshenko and Zelensky and Klitschko, are most unlikely to be able to effect a coup or a seizure of power in Kiev today. If a coup is going to come, it's going to be mounted by people like Yarosh and Belitsky. Now they, of course, are dead set against any compromise. They will want the war to continue until its most bitter end. They would undoubtedly prefer a total Ukrainian defeat, even at the cost of their own lives, to what they would see as a shameful surrender. And to say it straightforwardly, these people have no liking for the Europeans at all. In fact, they've never made any secret of their intense dislike of them. So, if the Europeans aren't very careful the stance they're taking, supporting Zelensky, trying to undermine American efforts to end the war before the disaster in Ukraine plays out. Well, all of that could burn the Europeans very, very badly indeed. We could see events start to take shape in Kiev, in Ukraine, that the Europeans don't expect and which would be profoundly embarrassing. At this point, I'm going to finish by repeating that advice I have given before, which is that given the trend of events in Ukraine, given where we are now, given the unlikelihood of peace in Ukraine, at least that's Peskov's view, and I suspect that he reflects the broader Russian view, given the forces that are present in Ukraine, it might be very wise if the various Western governments start from now to plan for the evacuation of their citizens from Ukraine. Just saying. I think that might be a more constructive and useful thing than all of these far-fetched and absurd plans of sending European troops to Ukraine, who will probably never go there, and who, if they did, would only prolong a war which is already lost. Anyway, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Can I just repeat again? You will find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.